Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech to the UN General Assembly's 75th annual session. The world has changed from when the United Nations was founded, but the fundamentals of cooperation remain the same. Yet, as the PM reminded the world leaders, the foundations of the world order are being systematically eroded. International agreements are being flouted and set aside. Great power rivalries are leading to arms races. Conflicts are proliferating and intensifying. Military occupations and illegal annexations are suppressing the rights of people to self-determination. The PM invoked the example of COVID-19 to drive home the point that in an interconnected world, no one is safe until everyone is safe. The PM also made a passionate case for occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. He talked about debt relief as the best chance for developing countries to get fiscal space and pointed to Pakistan's April proposal for a global initiative for debt relief. The PM also spoke about climate change and efforts made by Pakistan to address the challenge. He spoke about Islamophobia, referring particularly to India's case, a country ruled by a right-wing government with roots in a fascist organization. Ironically, in his speech, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi called for India to be given a seat at the high table, forgetting all the while that India has blatantly violated the very principles on which the UN was founded. To discuss the various points raised by the PM, and so the situation in the region, we are joined by Ambassador Munir Akram, Pakistan's permanent representative at the United Nations, and Ambassador Tehmina, Janjua, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. We shall also later be joined by Ambassador Tasnim, Aslam, a former Special Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let me begin with Ambassador Akram here. Ambassador Akram, a good thing was, for once the Prime Minister decided not to ad-lib, so the speech was written, structured, covered all the bases. And I think some of the points that he raised with reference to the role of the United Nations, and not just the role, but the very concept of the United Nations, and perhaps the discrepancy over the years that we have seen between that conceptualization and the role and the actual working and functioning of the United Nations. Give us a sense of how the speech went down with the world leaders.
I think it went down very well. As you know, though the Prime Minister read from the script this time, but he still managed to convey the passion which comes from speaking straight off the cuff, as he did last year. The speech was comprehensive and covered all the major issues of concern to the international community, as well as to Pakistan. I think it went down very well. It was termed as a powerful speech, a powerful statement. It was a statement that was bold, but at the same time, it hewed to positions that can form the basis of agreement within the United Nations. Of course, our case on Kashmir, on Islamophobia, on India's policies was clear, crystal clear, and remains the same as it has been traditionally. But I think the speech went down very well, and we have a lot of follow-up to do in the light of the proposals which he has put forward.
Right. So I was obviously watching and reading the Indian media. It's an occupational hazard. And the refrain was that, Prime Minister Khan's 2020 speech, as far as India is concerned, as far as illegally occupied and annexed Kashmir is concerned, was simply a rehash of what he said in 2019. And the underlying assumption seems to be, quite apart from a certain kind of hubris that we see in the Indian approach, was really, what does this matter? So give me a sense of, because the speech expended some capital in terms of the word count on what India is doing, not just the sort of, change of direction of India itself, but also what India is doing in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. So is the criticism that this is something that the world has got used to, and Pakistan keeps repeating this, and what difference does it really make on the ground? Is that sense right?
Well, a couple of points, George. First of all, Pakistan's position obviously has not changed. The underlying fundamental case that we have on Kashmir remains the same, and therefore it has to be repeated and will be repeated as such. The second, on Kashmir, the speech updated the developments that have taken place over the last year with regard to India's actions and especially on the demographic change that it is bringing, on the corrective punishments, the extrajudicial executions. Much of what the Prime Minister had predicted in his speech last year is happening inside occupied Kashmir. And thirdly, if India doesn't really care about what we say, why does it bother to then respond to Pakistan? It has in the past adopted a policy of not responding. And this time it did respond. Obviously, it does make a difference to them the position we're taking. But on the ground, the Security Council is now actively involved with the issue. We have a campaign here. The Indians obviously are making a counter-campaign. So they are actively engaged in opposing our position, and they do care what we say and what we do here at the United Nations. I think this is false hubris there. The hubris is in the media, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They are actively engaged in opposing us, and obviously we are actively engaged in promoting our case at the United Nations and globally.
Right. One more question, Ambassador Akram. And before I posit the question, let me read out from what the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said in his speech. And he spoke in Hindi, so I'm relying on the transcript which has been put out by the Indian media. And he said, for how long will India be kept out of the decision-making structures of the United Nations? A country which is the largest democracy of the world, a country with more than 18% of the world population, a country which has hundreds of languages, hundreds of dialects, many sects, many ideologies, a country which was a leading global economy for centuries, and also one which has seen hundreds of years of foreign rule. Now, he's obviously talking about the United Nations Security Council seat. Now, Pakistan has been leading for many, many years what was known as the Coffee Club and now is referred to as Uniting for Consensus. There seems to be another pitch for this by India. What exactly, in terms of the US backing and in terms of the backing of other countries like Germany and others, where does this issue stand right now?
I think, first of all, it should be a matter of some concern that India ascribes decision-making in the United Nations only to the Security Council. The General Assembly, in fact, is the apex body of the Security Council is supposed to report to the General Assembly. The powers of the General Assembly have been eroded by the Security Council and the great powers. So this is obviously a position that is not a popular position with the general membership of the United Nations, that people ascribe decision-making only to the Security Council, which does not reflect the Charter. Secondly, India's aspirations have been there for many, many years, and those aspirations they are pushing aggressively at the United Nations. They do not have the large census or the two-thirds majority that they require to make a charter amendment as such. If they had such a majority, they would have put forward a resolution to that effect. And our campaign, obviously, is to evoke support from the general membership to say that the creation of new permanent members is not the answer to Security Council reform or United Nations reform. It will make the Security Council even worse in terms of paralysis of power, the conflicting positions of great powers in the Council, which is the reason for its paralysis. So I think India's aspiration is the same. They will, no doubt, on the 75th anniversary session, try to press hard on this. My own assessment is that they will not get very far. The Uniting for Consensus remains united. We have considerable support. We are meeting this morning at the ministerial level in half an hour. But I think, as I've termed it in one of my responses, I think India's aspiration is a pipeline.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Akram speaking with us. Let me go to Ambassador Janjua here. Ambassador Janjua, I'm going to go in reverse. So in terms of India's approach to a seat at the high table, it seems to me that most countries that desire this seat at the high table, and India is not the only one, but it's trying to make a lot of pitch for this, are basically, if you look at it conceptually and also in practice, they're trying to do this to be part of the club that actually needs to reform itself. What I'm trying to say here is that it is essentially to try and get into a position of power given the lopsided nature or the balance or the imbalance between the UN Security Council and the General Assembly that Ambassador Akram was also referring to, instead of saying, well, reform the UNSC and make it more accountable to the UN General Assembly. Is that something that, in terms of what I get a sense of, do you think my sense is right?
Well, thank you very much. You are right, because it is, India is obviously looking at only one position in the Security Council and not looking at other decision-making processes, of which it is already a part, of which the entire being a part of the General Assembly, one is a part as well. Pakistan is a part of this as well. But we must remember that India's record is one which is abysmal as far as implementation of UN Security Council resolutions are concerned. So it completely fails on that. And of course, it is looking at a seat on the so-called high table in the Security Council because it expects itself to be a part of rulemaking. A rulemaking that it does not itself conform to, but expects others to conform to. So obviously, India has a double-faced view of it, as it's unfortunately is the way its government is postulated. And in this context, I'd like to, if I may say so, one, I'd like to congratulate Ambassador Munir Akram on the excellent speech of the Prime Minister, which I'm sure he drafted along with the Foreign Secretary as well, which covered a number of areas which were very significant. There are a number of proposals that the Prime Minister has made in the context of illicit financing, in the context of debt relief, in the context of climate change. All of these require implementation by the UN General Assembly. So it's the General Assembly that has to play a very important role, for which, of course, Ambassador Munir Akram, who's rightly placed in New York at this time, can do so with the help of the other members of the Security Council, of the General Assembly. A deeper understanding of history shows that Nehru's attitude was that of communalism, and it was this attitude that spoke the Muslims of India and Jinnah to ask for Pakistan in particular. So there is, even now, starting from Nehru, starting from Gandhi, there is been a veneer of secularism, which, if you strip off, is completely underneath communal. And if we refer to Nehru and Gandhi, we are giving the Indians fodder to talk about placing themselves at the high places for decision making. And therefore, it has been my concern that we should be careful when referring to Indian leadership, past and present leadership. What we do so, when we do so, we just give the impression that Modi is an aberration. No, he is not an aberration. He's a
Ambassador Janjua, I think you're making an excellent point and a very incisive point. And I'd just like to, with reference to the point that you're making, just like to add one thing, that as far as occupied and now illegally annexed Kashmir is concerned, the Congress governments, starting with Pandit Nehru, were as much callous towards how they dealt with Kashmir as Mr. Modi. As a matter of fact, as you know, A.G. Noorani's book on Article 370 and how Article 370 was hollowed out lays down a definitive history of that. But I also want to draw your attention, since you mentioned the money laundering thing. It seemed to me that, if you read between the lines, in a way, the Prime Minister was saying that FATF, whose job it is to actually track down such, transactions, has unfortunately become a geopolitical tool to suppress certain states and hound certain states, Pakistan being one of them, instead of actually doing the job that it is entrusted to do. Do you think my sense is correct on that score?
Well, obviously, the Prime Minister must be completely, would have that in mind when he's talking about it. And let's not forget, recently there's been a report in which 33 or so Indian banks have been implicated for money laundering. And therefore, how can India be pursuing an objective in FATF, which is completely, when you look at it, their own record is absolutely abysmal as far as the Indian record is concerned. And yes, if FATF has to talk about money laundering or illicit financing or terrorism, etc., it has to look at the Indian record as well and should not unilaterally, talk about Pakistan only, because Pakistan instead has taken a number of very, very solid measures that go in the way of implementing its international obligations in the context of money laundering as well as illicit financing, etc. It is India that now needs to be looked at carefully, and it is FATF's responsibility to do so.
Right. One of the points with reference to climate change that the Prime Minister accurately made was that while we contribute a fraction of a fraction of pollution to the planet, unfortunately, because of the patterns, the weather patterns, we are the ones that have begun to suffer quite a lot because of the emissions of the more developed countries. Since he's made this point, I just want to ask you, with reference to climate change, what kind of importance have we, according to it, in terms of our talking points with the external world?
A very important player in the discussions on climate change. In fact, when I was a second secretary in the 90s, we were involved in the UNCED process, and later on with the climate change negotiations, with the Global Environmental Facility and all of that. The reality is that Pakistan is considered amongst the top 10 fragile countries as far as climate change is concerned, and it is one of the countries that needs special attention. And that is why I must congratulate Ambassador Munir Akram, who would have written the statement along with the Foreign Secretary, to have referred to climate change and referring to how there should be $100 billion that should be mobilized annually to support countries, especially countries that are most vulnerable, like Pakistan, in dealing with climate, with its climate question. the $10 billion tree project that is there would greatly contribute. So what the Prime Minister is doing, he's not only talking in abstract terms, but hopefully we'll be able to implement the project of having the trees that are required to deal with some of the impact of climate change. But yes, there is a lot to be done. We used to have a national environmental report every year, and we hope we continue to have that, which clearly illustrates what Pakistan is required to do as a country. Each one of us in Pakistan as Pakistanis are required to do. I may also like to point out to you that there are a number of proposals that the Prime Minister has made. For example, US $500 billion SDRs for debt relief, building of a global framework to steer illicit flow of illicit funds, climate change to mobilize US $1 billion a year. In Islamophobia, UNGA should declare International Day to combat Islamophobia. And on Kashmir, the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions. Then global summit meetings to address regional hotspots and to help resolve issues. So these are very, very concrete proposals that the Prime Minister of Pakistan has gone ahead and presented. And we should look at these proposals seriously to be able to play a very significant role on the global scene.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ambassador Tehmina Janjua, speaking with us. We are now joined by Ambassador Tasnim Aslam, former Special Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Aslam, thank you for your time. Give me a sense of how you would rate the Prime Minister's speech at the United Nations, where he is, it seems that he has tried to cover all the bases and also made some concrete suggestions in terms of climate change, in terms of money laundering, in terms of Kashmir, in terms of various other things.
Overall, the speech started from where he left off last year. He updated the UN General Assembly on what has happened in Kashmir since he spoke there last year. He was very clear, very lucid on what Indian regime is doing, what is happening in Kashmir. And he also, in a way, called out the UN system. That it is their responsibility to ensure that India stops its illegal actions in Kashmir, because Jammu and Kashmir is a dispute on the UN Security Council agenda, and UN has done nothing practical to provide some relief to Kashmiris. So he talked about that. He talked about Palestine, which not many people are talking about these days. He also called out the Western world on money laundering. While Pakistan is being hauled up at the FATF, the Western countries are very happily storing the money, stolen money that goes from the developing countries, from Pakistan. Billions have gone and they are doing nothing. They don't see money laundering when the money comes to Europe and the US. So he talked about that. The continuation of their colonial era, where they were taking money from these developing countries and putting it in their economies. He talked about that. He talked about climate change and how countries like Pakistan, which have almost close to less than 1% role in global environmental degradation and climate change, but when it comes to paying for it, Pakistan is amongst the top 10 countries. He talked about that. He also talked about Islamophobia. So most of the themes he had covered last year as well. Obviously, the impact of the live speech is different. But under the circumstances where it was a recorded speech that was being played, it was a very good, very comprehensive speech.
Right. You also served as Additional Secretary, United Nations for a fairly long time, so you know the ins and outs of the system. Given that knowledge, what do you think, how would the speech have gone down with the world leaders?
To start with, I think it went down very well with Kashmiris. Palestinians reacted very positively, and there were accolades for the Prime Minister by the Palestinian permanent representative and other leadership. It would have resonated with the developing countries, the African countries, who suffer from the same double standards. And generally on the Muslim streets, where they are chagrined by the Islamophobia and discrimination. And also Indian Muslims would have noted that Prime Minister of Pakistan spoke for them and highlighted their plight, what they are undergoing, the kind of atrocities they are facing. He talked about that. He talked about COVID. So generally, I think depending on who is listening and who's reacting to it, the speech must have been noted by all.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Tasnim Aslam speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss, yes, tonight seems to be the Prime Minister's night. So we're going to discuss Prime Minister Imran Khan's op-ed in the US newspaper, The Washington Post, with reference to Pakistan's efforts to facilitate the peace process in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about Prime Minister Imran Khan's op-ed in The Washington Post, which puts on the table not only Pakistan's efforts to facilitate the peace process in Afghanistan, but also why Pakistan thinks it is vital that the war in Afghanistan should come to an end. We will also discuss Afghanistan again this week because Dr. Abdullah, Chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation of Afghanistan, is in Pakistan on a 3-day visit. But for now, let's get to what PM Khan had to tell the US and the world through his op-ed. And for that, we are joined by Rahimullah Yusufzai, who's the editor of the news, and Hamdullah Hamdard, a journalist based in Kabul. So let me begin with Mr. Yusufzai. Mr. Yusufzai, the Prime Minister is saying that talking about the experience of refugees and guns and drugs and violence, he said this experience taught us two important lessons. First, that we are too closely intertwined with Afghanistan by geography, culture, and kinship for events in that country not to cast a shadow on Pakistan. We also learned that peace and political stability in Afghanistan could not be imposed from the outside through the use of force. Only an Afghan-owned and Afghan-led reconciliation process, which recognizes Afghanistan's political realities and diversity, could produce a lasting peace. So it seems to me that the Prime Minister very solidly is putting across these two fundamental points with reference to Pakistan's policy. Do you think my sense is right?
I think you are right, because these are facts which have been reiterated, and I think it's a very timely article because the peace talks are going on in Doha. Already we have this US-Taliban peace agreement. Pakistan has been claiming that it played a very critical role in making this happen. So he is highlighting the problems of both Afghanistan and Pakistan. In particular, he is focusing on the issues which are very important for Pakistan. That's why he wants peace to return to Afghanistan. Pakistan, he says, has suffered the most after Afghanistan due to the conflict in Afghanistan for the last over 4 decades. I think that he has raised the issue of the Afghan refugees because Pakistan would want them to return. But that can only happen if there is peace and security in Afghanistan. So the issue also of Afghanistan's soil being used for attacks against Pakistan has been mentioned in the article. It's a very comprehensive piece, and I think that the message has been timely and properly conveyed.
Right. The reference to the stakeholders and who all have expended efforts in trying to get both sides to the table. Mr. Khan says the path we have traveled to get here wasn't easy, but we were able to press on thanks to the courage and flexibility that were on display from all sides. The United States and its allies facilitated the prisoner exchange between Kabul and the Taliban. The government of Afghanistan and the Taliban responded to the Afghan people's yearning for peace. Mr. Hamdard, it seems to me that there is a very clear sense, that with reference to the peace process, that this is something that must proceed and reach a logical conclusion, because not only is it extremely important for Afghanistan to finally, for this bloodshed to come to an end, but also for the security of the region.
I personally believe that the intra-Afghan peace negotiations should reach a very comprehensive conclusion. And as Imran Khan has also pointed out, there should be no hasty withdrawal of the international forces from Afghanistan. They have to take every step very responsibly, so that the post-war Afghanistan is a peaceful Afghanistan, in which will definitely have stable economic and political relationships, friendly relationships with the neighboring countries, and there should be no civil war once again. If there is a hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, and there is once again, God forbid, if there is once again a civil war in Afghanistan, then these peace talks will not have the result that people of Afghanistan want. So I believe that the Taliban and the Afghan government, as they have shown a lot of flexibility to each other, and the Pakistan's government have also supported the peace process in Afghanistan this time. We, the Afghan people, are thankful to them for being honest this time, or for staying honest to Afghan people. And one thing which Imran Khan has pointed out about the refugees of Afghanistan who are still there living under the government of Pakistan, they have to return. They have to return in any case to their country, make their businesses, make their lives here in Afghanistan. But for that, to make sure that they return to their country safe and sound, and make sure that they make a living here in Afghanistan, the international community, the Afghan government, and the Taliban, and also all those related parties who are involved in these peace negotiations of the Taliban and Afghan government, they have to carefully take steps forward, steps towards the peace negotiations results. The results are important. There should be tangible results for making sure that we Afghans will have a peaceful government, a peaceful Afghanistan after these peace negotiations, and there should not be any civil war from Daesh with the government or any other parties. Pakistan, Iran, and other neighboring countries should also make sure that they will support the peace process of Afghanistan, the peace negotiation of the Taliban and the Afghan government. In the post-war Afghanistan, supporting the post-war Afghanistan is very important. It should be supported by Pakistan, by China, by India, Russia, and all the other neighboring countries, to make sure that the Afghans will return to their country, and Pakistan can pay their attention. The Pakistani government can pay most of their attention to their own economic development and military strength in other parts that they have prioritized for their country and their people. The Afghans will only be able to return to their countries once they know that they will have, and they have, a peaceful Afghanistan, and there is no risk of another war in Afghanistan. So
absolutely.
I guess
as a matter of fact, this is something that Prime Minister Khan refers to in the op-ed, and he says it is also time to start planning for the day after. How can the world help a post-war Afghanistan transition to sustainable peace? How do we create conditions that will enable the millions of Afghan refugees living in Pakistan and other countries to return to their homeland with dignity and honor? One final question, Mr. Yusufzai. It seems to me that, this whole business of talking and dialoguing and bringing in stakeholders is something that we started talking about back during the Bonn process. We talked about it in 2003, in 2004, in 2006. But finally, this has come to some kind of fruition. So your final thoughts with reference to the ideas that the Prime Minister put in his op-ed. As I said, it seems to me that he covered all the bases.
I think that, his mention of avoiding a hasty withdrawal is important. Maybe he was trying to refer to the unpredictable nature of President Trump. Or maybe he was mentioning the US election, which can impact the withdrawal of forces and the peace talks. But let me tell you that, it is not going to be a hasty withdrawal. The withdrawal has to be completed by May next year. 14-month period was given after the Doha Accord. That's a long time. And I think all sides now know that there is a deadline and they have to try to make a peace agreement by that time. If they don't do that, the withdrawal will not take place by May 2021. Number one. Secondly, I think that, the issues highlighted by Imran Khan, like, say, the presence of people, anti-Pakistan elements who are threatening Pakistan, who are using Afghanistan soil. I think that's also important. So if there's a peace agreement, the issues of concern for Pakistan also have to be addressed, also have to be tackled. So we have a peace process now which is enjoying widespread international support. Regional countries, world powers, international organization, Afghan people, all the people in the world, they want peace in Afghanistan after 42 years of conflict. So I think that the conditions are right. The process is on track. We all are a bit, impatient that there has been no progress in the talks, but the talks only began on 12th of September.
Yeah,
and,
it's going to take
the
some
issues
time.
Are very contentious and difficult.
Absolutely. Issues are very contentious and difficult. Thank you so much. That was Rahimullah Yusufzai speaking with us. Very quickly, Mr. Hamdard, before I wrap up, how significant do you think is Dr. Abdullah's visit to Islamabad?
I believe Dr. Abdullah's visit to Islamabad is very useful for making or strengthening the friendly ties between the Pakistani government and the Afghan government. As we all know that in the past, the two governments did not experience friendly relation with each other. They were always blaming each other, playing the blame game with each other. So I guess now it's the right time, as Yusufzai also pointed out. The Afghan government is cooperating with the Pakistani government, and the Pakistani government is cooperating the Afghan peace process, and Taliban are also showing some flexibility. The international community is also there to support the Afghan peace process. I believe the visit of Dr. Abdullah in Pakistan, this will definitely have positive results. It will definitely support and push the peace process and will further get Pakistani government to support the peace process between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And this is a good news for the Afghan nation here in Afghanistan and those who are living under the government of Pakistan there in your country.
We will obviously bother you and other Afghan friends to talk about that, because as I said in my opening, Dr. Abdullah's visit is something that we're going to cover. He's going to be here until Wednesday. But for now, this is all from In Focus tonight. So thank you so much, Hamdullah, Hamdard. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.